Okay, and it is 12:04, so we got a full program, so I want to get started. Welcome, everybody, to our Maine Won't Wait Climate Action Plan Update webinar. Let's get started. We'll start with the obvious. Maine's climate is changing, right? More than a century of burning fossil fuels has altered the chemical composition of our atmosphere and changing the landscapes that we're used to here in Maine. We are seeing these changes firsthand, evidenced by scientifically measured 3 degrees increased warming trend in the state since 1895, a growing season which has lengthened by about 16 days since 1950, and a Gulf of Maine that is warming faster than almost any other water body on Earth. We must act, and we are acting. In 2019, Governor Mills convened the Maine Climate Council to develop a 4-year plan to address the impacts of climate change, build resiliency, and help the state meet statutory targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That plan, called Maine Won't Wait, was released in December 2020, which is closing in on 4 years ago. Remember, this is a 4-year plan. So by law, the plan must be updated by December 2024, this year. And so the Maine Climate Council is hard at work now reviewing their progress and coming up with new recommendations. That's why we're here today. Back in 2020, some of you may have been with us. We did a bunch of webinars about the first iteration of the Climate Action Plan, trying to encourage it to be as strong as possible and to talk about what might be in it. And now we're back to talk about the update. So today we have a great crew of folks who are involved with the Climate Action Plan in one way or another, to tell you about what we're doing and how you can help. To review, and I will introduce people as they come on, but we're joined by Maine Audubon, that's me, Conservation Law Foundation, CLF, the Natural Resources Council of Maine, and Maine Conservation Voters, MCV. Thank you so much to the groups who are here today to present their knowledge. And thanks to all of you, 121 of you so far, which is fantastic, for joining to learn. Quickly, we'll talk about the agenda. This is the welcome portion. And let me say again, welcome. I'm going to turn it over in a minute to Jack Shapiro to talk about what the Maine Climate Council is, how that process worked back in 2020. We'll turn it over to Kathleen from MCV, who will talk about the progress we've made on the plan since 2020 in those 4 years. And then we will focus on 2 working groups. So the Climate Action Plan, as you'll hear, is broken up into different working groups that focus on different areas. We are spotlighting a couple of those today. One is the Transportation Working Group, and we're joined by Emily Green from CLF to talk about that, and the Natural and Working Lands Working Group, to be discussed by my colleague Chess Gundrum on the call. Then we'll end with some opportunities to get involved and some Q&A, and that's how it goes. There's a Q&A box down at the bottom of the screen, I believe, and we're gonna, or is it in the chat, Maggie? We will be monitoring questions.
There's a Q&A.
There's a Q&A, perfect. Put your questions if you want down in the Q&A box, and we can save them to the end, but we are going to save them all to the end because we've got a lot to go through. And with that, let's go. I'm going to turn it over to Jack Shapiro from NRCM.
Awesome, thanks, Nick. Doing webinars with Nick's always a reminder that I have to up my hosting game. So thanks, Nick, for bringing us all in together. And I'm just thinking about all the other folks that are on this call, and both from some of the groups that we work with all the time. I think I've worked with every other one of these groups on multiple different policy priorities just in the last few months, whether that's the future of natural gas or transmission lines or offshore wind or all of these other important things. So it's really great to have everyone here on the call today talking about this this really important issue, because as Nick said, the climate crisis is not going away. We saw this winter, exactly the kinds of things that scientists have been warning us about in terms of climate impacts for decades. Unseasonably warm winter storms bringing more increased extreme precipitation and flooding damage, the highest tides ever recorded, doing severe damage on our coastline. 60% of Maine's working waterfronts damaged during those storms in January. So the urgency of this is really still at its height. You know, the good news really is that Maine has been taking action over the past 5 years or so. You know, in 2019, just to sort of remind us how we got here, you know, there was about 8 years in Maine where we had almost no action on climate change, and in fact, we had some state leaders that were, you know, essentially hostile to climate action. And so in 2019, there was really some pent-up demand for moving forward, and taking some significant steps to put climate policies in place in Maine. And there were a number of them that got passed in the 2019 session. There was solar legislation. There was a really important bill to set our clean energy standard to 80% clean energy supply by 2030 and 100% by 2050. But one of the core ones was this was the bill that created the Maine Climate Council and put in place really ambitious greenhouse gas emissions reduction standards, and those are statutory. Those are required by law. We have to meet those under the law. They're not just goals. They're not optional. And those are 45% below 1990 levels by 2030 and 80% gross emissions by 2050. So really strong leadership from the governor here and from many of the you can see representatives from some of our groups in that picture there on the screen there. But you can't just sort of set these goals. You can't set these standards without having a plan to get there. And so this bill also created the Maine Climate Council, which initiated a really big and broad stakeholder process and public engagement process to figure out what are all the different components that we need to start work now at that time in 2019, 2020, to make sure that we're hitting those goals in 2030, 2040, and 2050. So this slide is the structure of the. You can go to the next slide. That's the structure of the Climate Council and all of the groups that were part of it. The scientific and technical subcommittee. If you're looking for a rundown on climate science in Maine, go to the Climate Council website and check out the scientific and technical subcommittee report. It's 300 pages, and it takes all of the science that's been done globally and nationally on climate, and it puts it into context in Maine. What does it mean for Maine? The equity subcommittee was working on, what are the impacts of both climate, but also our response to it, disproportionately on different populations in the state. As we know, Maine it's a rural state, it's a low income state, it's an older state, and all of these things need to be taken into consideration as well as we think about all the sector specific things, whether that's resilience or coastal and marine ecosystems, some of the big sectors that are the source of our emissions, whether that's transportation, which is about half of our emissions, buildings, the places where we live and work, go to school, that's about a quarter or so of our emissions, and natural and working lands. What is the role of farmland, forest land, other things, and how do we make sure that we're not overlooking the impacts on those lands as we make this transition to clean energy. You can go to the next slide. So as Nick mentioned, in 2020, the plan came out. It started with those working groups, several months of work and public input, made recommendations to the full Climate Council. The Climate Council deliberated, and in December 1st, 2020, published Maine Won't Wait, Maine's Climate Action Plan. It's no first plan is going to be perfect. We of course, and many others, recognize that there are some ways that we can improve this plan. But it's one of the best statewide climate plans in the country. It actually won a National Planning Award in 2022 for its process and its thoroughness as we look towards how are we going to get to where we need to go on climate in Maine. So you can see here with the goals and strategies, the level of comprehensiveness that's here. Each strategy has several specific implementation actions that are recommended. And whether that's on things like clean energy or the industrial sector or resilience, health, all of these things. And this climate plan really has driven a lot of our collective work in the environmental community. And I'm sure that many of you on the call have been involved in different aspects of the implementation of this over the past few years. But we've been working on in the transportation sector, things like the clean cars standards. In energy, solar has increased by 700%. We're working on onshore wind in northern Maine and offshore wind in the Gulf. Maine is a international leader really in heat pump adoption. One of the core technologies we'll need to stop burning fossil fuels to heat our buildings, as well as weatherization and efficiency. So a lot of work flows down from this plan. And that's, I think, why many of us are really excited to be here to help craft the next round of Maine's climate action plan. What progress have we made? What does that mean for the next really important steps that we have to take in these key sectors? And how can we keep pushing forward? Because the physics and the science of this isn't waiting for us. And so we won't wait either. So I think next I'm either going to pass it to Kathleen or back to Nick to pass it to Kathleen, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the specific things that we've achieved on climate as a state over the past 4 years. So I will turn it back over.
Thanks, Jack. And we can go right to Kathleen Meal from MCV to take it from here.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks, Jack, for setting that up so well. And thanks to all of you for being with us today. So Maine Won't Wait came out in 2020. It's 2024. Is our award-winning climate action plan working? It's really important to know what progress we've made through the first iteration of Maine Won't Wait as we're crafting the second iteration. So I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour through some of the data and metrics that we look at all the time to answer that question. But the really exciting news is you can also answer that question yourself. Last year, the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation and the Future launched this really cool interactive dashboard that you see on the screen here. And we'll include that link in follow-up emails and all of that. So you can click through and take a look at a map of the state that lets you focus in on heat pump installation, electric vehicle charging stations, clean energy jobs, land conservation, all of those things that were called for in the climate action plan. You can actually see what progress we're making towards those targets. Like I said, I'll give you a quick intro. So if we go to the next slide, we'll start where the climate action plan starts, with transportation. There's a reason that transportation was the first strategy named, and all of our strategies are equally important and all our favorites. But when we think about transportation, we have to know it's the most polluting sector of our economy, responsible for almost half of all emissions from fossil fuel combustion in the state of Maine. So it doesn't have to be that way. And to embrace the future of transportation in Maine, the Climate Council recommended a couple of key strategies. One is we have a target of having more than 200,000 electric vehicles on the road by 2030. You can see that we have a ways to go, but we are definitely moving in the right direction. And Emily is going to talk a little bit later in the program about some of the steps we can take to move a little faster. One thing we know is that range anxiety, that where am I going to charge my car, is a big deal for new EV drivers. And so we're investing in a big way in EV charging infrastructure. Now, I have to say, we have a lot of data that tells us that most EV drivers end up charging at home or at work the vast majority of the time. And there are lots of programs in place to incentivize charging at home or at work. But we also know that it's really important to have a visible network of public charging infrastructures as a signal that we're taking this seriously. And the good news is we're taking this seriously on a nationwide level. There's been a ton of federal funding through the bipartisan infrastructure law to support building out EV charging stations. Federal funding also makes it possible for school districts across Maine and across the country to get kids on electric school buses. I love this picture here. It is from the town I live in, Camden, where the the finance director for the school system actually got his bus license because he was so excited to drive an EV school bus in one of the town's parades. So this is a big deal. Maine is doing a phenomenal job accessing this opportunity. The Environmental Protection Agency has a clean school bus program that makes more than $5 billion available over the next 5 years across the country. And just to brag a little bit, Maine is leading the country with the 4th most EV bus awards per capita of all 50 states, and the most per capita in New England. There are a lot of other things that go into reducing transportation emissions, and Emily will talk more about that in a little bit. But let's turn to buildings. Buildings are the other really responsible sector of our economy for when it comes to emissions, and we're the most heating oil dependent state in the country. So if you look at the rest of the country, there's maybe 4% of homes heated by fossil fuels, by fuel oil, not fossil fuel, by fuel oil. And here in Maine, it's closer to 60%. That makes us really vulnerable to volatile prices. And it means there's a strong economic rationale behind the state's heat pump goals. I hope you have heard how well we are doing when it comes to those goals. Back in 2019, we set the goal of installing 100,000 heat pumps by 2025. We have blown right past that goal, and in fact set a new one last year to raise our aspirations and install 275,000 heat pumps by 2027. The thing I want to let you know about here is that Maine is being really thoughtful about making sure that we all have access to this money-saving, climate-saving, comfort-saving technology. So we have specific targets, sub-targets, about how many heat pumps, how many home weatherization projects are specifically going to low-income households in Maine. Just last week, the state was awarded a $10 million federal grant, again, through the bipartisan infrastructure law, that will support the installation of high-efficiency heat pump systems in rural, mobile, and manufactured homes. About 65,000 Maine households live in rural, mobile, or manufactured homes. So this is a big deal, and it reflects a lot of progress that we've made because that award was granted based on a pilot program that's been super successful. Changing gears to the carbon emissions, which is clearly an important strategy in the climate action plan. State law requires that Maine electric suppliers provide an increasing amount of new renewable energy to Maine consumers. In 2019, as Jack said, we set that target at 80% clean energy by 2030 and 100% by 2050. We are making rapid progress toward that goal. And last year, Governor Mills announced that we would increase our ambitions to hit that 100% clean energy threshold by 2040, a full decade sooner than we thought was possible just a few years ago. Meeting these targets means we'll have to make additional investments in affordable renewable energy. You can see that solar is a huge part of that. That top graph shows just how much the solar installations have taken off in the last few years. And offshore wind will be a big part of that. Just last summer, we passed really transformative legislation to install 3 gigawatts of offshore wind energy capacity by 2040. Many of us worked on that. You've probably heard about it from us a few times, and there's good reason for that. It's a big deal. You may be sensing a theme here that meeting our goals is important both for our climate and for our economy. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see we're paying a lot of attention to growing our workforce, to attract and retain young people. And when it comes to new industries like offshore wind, to set really high standards up front for how we build those projects. We want clean energy jobs to be good family sustaining jobs. And the Clean Energy Partnership Program that was established in 2022 does a ton to grow the workforce and increase innovation in our clean energy sector. Governor Mills set a goal to reach 30,000 clean energy jobs in Maine by 2030. We are on our way, but we are going to double that total. That 2022 total will double in the next few years. In addition to those new jobs in new sectors, we go to the next slide. The Climate Council is paying a lot of attention to supporting and growing our heritage industries as well. Fishing and farming and forestry, outdoor recreation, which just on its own is a $3 billion industry in Maine and supports 41,000 jobs. That's all good news for our workforce. It's also really important for us to make the most of the nature-based climate solutions that are available to us by and we have a goal of conserving 30% of land in Maine by 2030. We are on our way. The Land for Maine's Future program is one of our most successful tools to do that. LMF secures access to mountains and lakes and rivers and shorelines in all 16 counties and has been incredibly successful. The other exciting thing about LMF is that every dollar of LMF funding is matched by other funds. So we are really making the most of every investment we make. With Maine Won't Wait, the Climate Council acknowledged that a lot of the work, a good chunk of the work of reducing our emissions, transitioning to clean energy, and especially becoming more resilient to climate impacts, that work has to happen at the local level. And the Climate Council also acknowledged that Maine communities need technical and financial support to lead that work. So the Climate Council recommended the creation of a Community Resilience Partnership Program, which launched in 2021. It's now serving more than 170 cities, towns, and tribal governments across the state. That's not even counting those communities that found out just last week that they are part of the 3rd round of funding through the Community Resilience Partnership Program. We are really helping communities lead. That's important because, as Jack reminded us, those storms we saw in December and January were a reminder we probably didn't need, that we have a lot of work to do when it comes to climate-ready infrastructure and resilience. I think Chess is going to talk a little bit about that later. And moving to the next, my last slide, don't worry, is it's going to take all of us. We know it. It's going to take all of us. So engaging with Maine people and communities is a huge part of this work. It's honestly why organizations like ours are hosting events like this, and there are lots of other opportunities. We will make sure you have information about those. But without further ado, let's turn our attention to the work that's going on right now and the work that is going to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. I'm Emily Green. I'm a senior attorney with Conservation Law Foundation, a regional nonprofit focused on solving our most critical environmental challenges. Here in Maine, I work on clean energy and climate change with a focus on transportation decarbonization. And I'm a member of the Transportation Working Group, and I was the last time around in 2020 as well. So next slide, please. To quickly orient you, in the next 10 minutes, and I'm setting my timer now so I don't mess up, I'm going to talk first about why it is so important that we cut emissions from transportation. I'm then going to give you a quick overview of the Transportation Working Group, which Kathleen already gave us a really good introduction to. And then I'm going to go over some of the policies that are being discussed in the working group right now. So first, let's talk about why it matters that we clean up transportation. Next slide, please. So the first, back one, Maggie. The first big reason, thank you, is that cars and trucks emit greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane that contribute to climate disruption. And as you already heard, it is critical that transportation be a primary focus of any climate mitigation strategy or plan because it is the leading source of climate pollution nationwide. But here in Maine, the contribution is particularly high. Half of greenhouse gas emissions in our state come from vehicles. And part of the reason that transportation makes up such a big piece of the pie is that it's really stubborn. So while Maine has made gains in other spaces like electricity generation or industry, transportation emissions have held pretty much steady for the last 30 years. This makes a lot of sense if you think about it. With electricity generation or industrial facilities, you're dealing with a relatively small number of entities that are already pretty heavily regulated. Whereas there are over 1 million light-duty vehicles in Maine. Those are the cars and trucks that you and I drive around. And those vehicles contribute 60% of transportation emissions. So transportation policy is complex. On the one hand, you have the logistical challenges of so many vehicles distributed across the state. And on the other hand, it can feel more personal for people than say, where is the electricity coming from? Now, it's not just climate that makes it important that we focus on transportation. So next slide, please. Tailpipe emissions are also bad for health. This should come as no surprise to anyone that has ever seen or smelled the stuff coming out of a tailpipe. And I am talking about both cars running on gasoline as well as big trucks running on diesel. Tailpipe pollution includes nitrogen oxides, which become smog, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter. These are toxins and dust, dirt, soot, and smoke that are really bad for people to breathe. Tailpipe emissions can lead to health problems, including asthma, lung disease, cancer, and it's worse for those of us that are already the most vulnerable. Young people, older people, people with existing conditions. Unsurprisingly, air pollution from cars and trucks disproportionately impacts people that are more exposed to it. So people who live close to highways or depots or ports suffer more. And these tend to be people that are low income or people of color. So transportation is not only a climate issue, it's not only a health issue, it's also an environmental justice issue. So we've got a lot of really important reasons to figure out better pathways forward for transportation. The Transportation Working Group really has its work cut out for it. And so let's switch gears and talk about the Transportation Working Group a little bit. These are actual videos of the last meeting of the Transportation Working Group. So you can see we've got a lot of good folks working on the issues. As you've heard, like the others, the Transportation Working Group is charged with developing recommendations for slashing climate pollution. Those will be submitted to the Climate Council in June. The Climate Council will take those recommendations into consideration in developing the actual climate action plan. The Transportation Working Group has about 30 to 40 members on it. It's a diverse group. There are some lawmakers and representatives of different state agencies. There are a handful of climate or transportation advocates like me. And then there are folks representing labor, automobile dealers, transit districts, loggers, general contractors, and many others. Also, like the other working groups, in order to conquer this massive transportation sector, this working group has created topical subgroups to put recommendations on the table for discussion by the larger working group. And we're in the first part of that process now. So recommendations are being developed in these subgroups. They're starting to be introduced to the entire transportation working group for vetting and discussion, and then they'll be getting fleshed out between April and June or so. So next slide, please. So what recommendations are actually on the table? I am going to talk about recommendations falling within two broad categories of transportation strategies, those that clean up vehicles and then those that help people drive less. So next slide, please. First, let's talk about making vehicles cleaner. When we talk about cleaning up vehicles, electrification has proven itself to be the best way to do so for the vast majority of vehicles on the road. That includes the cars and trucks that you and I drive around, but also buses, shuttles, vans, and most trucks. Now, as you heard before, the previous climate action plan set very aggressive electrification goals. It also spurred development of a roadmap back in 2021 to identify policies, programs, and regulatory changes to meet those EV goals. And since then, the state has done a lot to ready the state for widespread transition to electrification, as Kathleen described. They've been working on developing a robust public charging network, tapping into ample federal funding opportunities. They've also developed a generous rebate program with additional incentives for low-income Mainers. But even with all of these state efforts, Maine is falling behind on our EV goals. We have over 12,000 EVs on the road as of 2023, almost 3 times what we had back in 2020. But we're aiming to have 41,000 by 2025. So we still have a long way to go. So next slide, please. Now, there's a whole lot of ideas that the working group is currently considering to help push the electrification markets forward. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into all of them, but I want to emphasize that the transition to electric vehicles has to be a just one that doesn't leave Mainers behind. And the other thing I want to note is that we can't forget about vans and trucks and shuttles. Although they're less than 10% of the vehicles on the road here, they're about a quarter of transportation climate pollution. The state does have a medium and heavy duty roadmap underway, which should be helpful, but I just want to make sure we don't forget about those. So now I'm just going to take a quick deeper dive into the first item you see there. Thank you, the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule. A big part of the holdup in terms of getting Mainers into EVs is that the vehicles people want to drive simply aren't available here. So they may be being produced and sold, but just not here in Maine. So there is a solution. It is a rule called the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule. It's already been adopted in 12 other states, including Vermont, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. The rule requires manufacturers to bring more and more electric vehicles for sale into the state. It doesn't require Mainers to buy anything in particular. It doesn't impact sales of used vehicles. But what it does is it increases options for people that do want a cleaner vehicle that saves them money. Go figure. So the state has called this rule the most critical thing that can be done to meet our electrification goals. And the Department of Environmental Protection is currently considering adopting it right now, and is expected to vote on it on March 20th at the Civic Center in Augusta. Now, you might think this would be a no-brainer, but the opposition to this rule is fierce, and that is why we're asking for your support on March 20th. We will be gathering in front of the Civic Center before the proceeding kicks off at 8:30 to show that Mainers want the choice to drive electric. So I hope you'll join us. Next slide, please. So the other major bucket of transportation strategies are those that help people drive less. And that means everything from co-locating housing with transit to developing walkable neighborhoods to improving access to transit to building safe bike lanes. When we talk about these strategies, we really need to be thinking about not just slashing emissions, but making sure that Mainers are able to safely, efficiently, affordably get where they need and want to go, even without a car. So reducing vehicle miles traveled is about emissions reduction, but it's also about improving the day-to-day lives of Mainers. I want to pause for a moment and ask you to think about your typical day. Maybe you go to a class, swing into the gym on your way home. Maybe you run some errands or pick up the kids or go to a doctor's appointment. How many of you rely on a car on a regular basis? And for those of you that do, think about your day and ask yourself what it would look like if you didn't have access to a car. I think I can safely say for just about everybody living in the state of Maine that not having a car makes it much more complicated to get all of those things done, if not impossible. And it doesn't need to be like that. So that is part of the framing that we're thinking about as we think about strategies to help people to drive less. Some of the things that the working group is starting to think about include setting tangible metrics for increasing access to public transportation, and sort of similarly, setting specific milestones for active transportation. That includes biking, walking, other modes of rolling, as well as dedicated funding. And we'll have more information about the strategies on the table in the next couple of weeks or so when the Transportation Working Group reconvenes to focus on this bucket of reducing vehicle miles traveled. So please stay tuned. There's a lot of exciting ideas on the table and still much work to be done and many opportunities for public input to come. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Emily. I'm going to turn it over now for an additional 10 minutes to my colleague Chess Gundrum to talk about the Natural and Working Lands Working Group.
Thanks, Emily. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, everybody, for being here with us. I'm going to set my own timer, and I'm sorry in advance, I don't have any bird gifts to offer you. But next presentation, I'm on it. That was good inspiration, Emily. Okay, so I'm going to focus on a few things, kind of following the same flow that Emily took on here. First off, and Nick might have just mentioned too, but I'm policy advocate at Maine Audubon. So I'm in our advocacy department. First off, I'm going to tell you why it's the work that the Natural and Working Lands Working Group is doing is important. First off, Maine's natural and working lands are really key to us achieving carbon neutrality by 2045, one of our major goals for the Climate Council. And then I'll talk a little bit about who's on the group and what our process has been like. Again, it's mirroring a lot of what the transportation group has done, and we've broken up our expertise into subgroups over the last couple months, and then talk a little bit about what those groups are doing and focus a little bit more so on the group that I've been working on. So we'll kick it off. Next slide, please. Okay, so why does this matter? So right now we're losing natural and working lands to development and climate change. Maine loses around 10,000 acres of natural and working lands every year to development pressures from housing, from other kinds of expansive developments. And we know that Maine's forests can sequester 60% and up to 75% potentially of our annual carbon emissions. And beyond our forests, coastal sand dunes, marshes, wetlands, and other critical habitats such as these offer natural climate solutions to flooding and erosion. We've mentioned these storms this past winter, the big one in December, the two in January. We know that what we do to protect these kinds of lands will better protect us against more frequent and more severe storms leading into the future here. And like all things climate, there's a lot of intersection in the work that we're doing in terms of solutions that benefit, that have co-benefits for farming, for forestry, outdoor recreation, biodiversity, of course, something that's very important to Maine Audubon, and more. Next slide, please. Thanks. So who's on the group? So we have about 30 folks, and it's really diverse. So we've got some legislators from Maine's natural resource legislative committees, such as the Environment and Natural Resources Committee, the Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry Committee. We've got folks from land trusts, environmental organizations, staff from our natural resource agencies, farmers, food distributors, markets, hunting and fishing groups, foresters, loggers, and more. Next slide, please. So similar again to transportation, we've divided ourselves into three subgroups. So we've got the local food group, the forest carbon group, and the land conservation group. And I'm going to just breeze through local food and forest carbon as I'm on the land conservation group. So the major goal for the local food subgroup is to make it so that 30% of our local food, 30% of food consumed in Maine is done locally. Currently, we're at 10%. And this is going to be a challenging goal to meet for a variety of reasons. One, we're also dealing with a lack of data, both from how much food is actually produced in the state, how much is, how far it goes, and where it's purchased, et cetera. And then product availability is also a big challenge. So if you go to the grocery store and you're looking for those Maine products, compared to other states in particular, we kind of face challenges in getting those products onto the shelves for folks to purchase. Cost barriers are big too. It's expensive to run a farm, and the costs of running that business generally are high, and the cost barriers for folks to buy the food is also high. So what can we do to help lower costs for everybody all around is something that this group has been zeroing in on. And then a lot of the farming that's happening in Maine is small scale. So what can we do to help make it so we have more small scale production, and then maybe more mid-size and beyond production in the state? And then a huge piece, which is threaded through pretty much every single issue we're all working on, is funding. We really need money to purchase new land, and specifically farming land that's got really high quality soils. So there's federal monies, land trusts, Maine Farmland Trust, and others are doing really incredible work to help acquire new land for farmers, but we need more. So there are, thankfully, for all of these questions, there are, bills, for example, in the legislature right now to help expand funding and to address these issues. So that's where I'll stop there for that group. And then the next group is the forest carbon subgroup. So talked a little bit about the importance of forest carbon sequestration for Maine to reach our carbon neutrality goals. And Maine's the most forested state in the nation. So here's a huge opportunity for us. So the goal for this group is just to maximize forest carbon storage opportunities across the state. So some big questions that the group is wrestling with right now are increasing incentives for carbon storage programs, because right now they're a little too low. So it makes it harder for landowners to want to enroll into these programs. And so we're working on that, as well as offering increasing opportunities to get that technical assistance to landowners that they need in order to get into these programs, because it's kind of wonky. It's a little complicated sometimes to figure out how to enroll. So we're both working on that piece, and there's some more legislation this session that's actually working on a few of our state tax programs to make those incentives for enrolling into carbon storage and other good forest practices stronger and better. So that piece. And then the last, so that's good. We'll move on. So I'm going to dig in just a little bit more into the subgroup that I'm on. And this group, our main goal is to figure out how we conserve 30% of land in Maine by 2030. And Kathleen breezed through this at the top, but we're at around 22% already, which is about 4.3 million acres. That's great, but we need to get a lot more of that land into that percentage in order to reach our goal by 2030. And in order to do that, we need to increase the rate of conservation by at least 5 times. So that is it's more than 200,000 acres a year over the next 7 years. So we definitely have our work cut out for us. And this all conserved land here includes lands that the Maine Natural Areas Program has in their database under conserved lands. It includes permanently conserved lands owned by nonprofits, the state, the federal government, local governments, fee-owned parcels, and forest and farmland easements. If you look to the left, I do not expect anybody to be able to read that key, and you don't need to, it's all good. Whatever colored blocks you see on the map, that represents land that's currently conserved. So you can kind of see how it's speckled across the landscape. And you'll notice that most of our conserved land is in northern and western Maine, and mountaintops and wetlands are most well represented. Mountaintops in particular are pretty cheap lands, so those are pretty easy for us to acquire. We'll move on to the next one, Maggie. Great, so some questions that our group is wrestling with. Funding again, here it is. So funding to get more land into our 30% percentage is huge. And there's a lot of federal monies out there, but they often require matching. You heard from Kathleen about how incredible our Land for Maine's Future program is. That's our most successful land conservation program in the state. We've conserved more than 600,000 acres with that program. And in 2021, we, for the first time ever, drew in some funding from the state budget into LMF, the Land for Maine's Future program, which was huge. So from 2021, we've got $10 million every year for 4 years. And that's been super helpful. And there've been some great projects in the pipeline. And money has already been doled out, which is great, but we need more, and we need to come up with ways to make sure that that funding is reliable into the future. So there's that piece. And then I'll mention one other thing about LMF, that we made it so that now money that goes into LMF goes into a trust fund, which accrues interest, which is great, because before the money would get moved in and then it would just sit there. So now, just since the trust fund came into effect a couple months ago, we're at, I believe, more than $350,000 of interest that we've accrued on that account, which is great. So that is more money right there. So those are some examples of where we are having some successes, but there's a lot more work to do. The other piece I'll mention too is that this work takes people power. And we need to make sure that we are funding and staffing our natural resource agencies appropriately so that they can really do this work and do it well. So we need to make Maine an attractive state to work. And right now, our natural resource agencies are compared to other states. We don't pay as well in Maine, and we have 1 in 5 of our positions in the state are currently vacant. So the environmental community in particular is working really hard to make sure that our natural resource agencies get the support that they need to do the good work. I'm running low on time, so I'm going to really breeze through and just say that the other big, pressures that we're up against here are development. I mentioned the housing. We need 40,000 homes in Maine to keep up with underproduction, and another 40,000 by 2030. That's a lot. So we need to figure out where that housing goes and make sure that we are avoiding lands that should be conserved, farming and otherwise. We're also weighing numerous conservation priorities. You can see the list there all throughout our work. So everything we do has a balance to it. And then the last thing I'll say is, I've just sort of breezed through what conservation lands is, but what really does that mean? So you can go to the next slide, Maggie. We've been wrestling with a definition, and I'm not going to read this to you, and I don't expect you to read it right now. But I'll just say that we have spent a lot of time as a group digging into and looking at other states' definitions of what conserved lands means, because it really does matter. We could conserve a whole bunch of brownfields and get to our 30% and other, not low grade lands and get there quickly, but that's not actually going to help us reach our climate goals. That's not speaking to the character of Maine and what matters to us. So we have spent a lot of time outside of our meetings too, trying to refine a definition. And this is where we're at right now. There's still some more editing to go, but I'll just say the key word there that I am hanging on to with our definition is durably. So everything I just said, we could conserve a whole bunch of land that, is low grade and won't actually help us reach our goals. But that's not what we want to do. We want to make sure that that's permanently conserved and the land provides services and values to people and wildlife. I think that's where I'm stopping. Maggie, can you remind me? Yes. Okay. We've got a lot of meetings coming up. Join us. There's a lot of really good work. We always make space for public comments, and I'm probably stealing Nick and Kathleen's thunder here, but it really is an incredible opportunity. And I'll just say before I turn it over that I have such gratitude for the people that I work with on this group and beyond. This is really intense work, and it's really an honor and a privilege to be a part of this process and to help make sure that Maine is a state that we can all live and thrive on into the future. So we take it very seriously, and I'll pass it on to Nick there. And thanks everybody for your time.
Thank you, Chess. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Maggie. Thank you, everyone. We're going to try one last slide, and then we're going to dive into questions. We have a lot of questions. And if folks want to put more of them in the Q&A box, that'd be great. And if my panelists want to look through them and see if there's any they want to look at. But I want to just sort of end with this slide, is that there's a lot more information to come. You will be receiving an email, participants and registrants, with the links that we talked about today and some other ways to act moving forward. You can see here ways to contact the Maine Climate Council now. Some guides from the state for taking action in homes, schools, communities, businesses, you name it. There is some information about the March 20th BEP Clean Cars Rule meeting that Emily talked about. That's down there with the date and the time. And then this, we hope, is the first in a series of webinars as the Climate Council, the Climate Action Plan update process rolls along to keep you updated on what's going on. So one of the next big opportunities is in June, when updated recommendations from the working groups will be available. There'll be comment periods and there'll be opportunities to get involved at that point. And we will be back, hopefully, to talk with you then. We also are hoping to do highlights and focuses on different working groups, including coastal resiliency, to talk about what we can do to help our shorelines as seas rise and tides and waves keep crashing. So tune in to there. But for now, I want to get to some questions. So again, please put those down in the Q&A box. While the panelists maybe take a peruse through, I want to look at some of the ones that may have been answered already. Some questions come through in our quick thinking, no time off panelists like to answer them sort of in the middle of the stream here. So let me just recall a couple of those because there's some good ones here. One, a couple of folks asked about what happens when we change governors. What happens if a governor is elected who is less excited about climate progress? What happens to the plan now? Emily answered a couple of times, and I'll just read these off. The plan itself does not have the force of law. So a governor who follows does not need to follow the plan. However, as Jack mentioned early on, the state's climate mandates are statutory. They are law, and so would need to require an act of the legislature in order to remove those or change those or something. That's something, of course, that's much harder to do if you're just a governor, and something, of course, we will oppose strongly. And so it would make sense for any governor, since these things are already in statute, to want to use the big guidebook that everybody put together to try to meet them. We will see how that goes. And we hope whatever governor comes along is as excited about meeting our climate goals as Governor Mills is. I want to see if we get a couple of questions about public participation. I know Emily was interested in answering one of those. Kathleen, Emily, can I turn it to you to talk about that piece?
Happily, although I accidentally pressed that button and then couldn't figure out how to undo it. But yeah, no, I would really just point to the opportunities that Nick highlighted in the final slide. There is always a portal available that you can access at any time, and you're able to go through the list and pinpoint the specific working group that you want to send comments to. So, and I think Chess mentioned earlier, most of the working group meetings also reserve time at the end for members of the public who have been observing to provide comments and feedback. Thanks.
Thank you. Well done on the spot. There was a really interesting question that came in early from Andre here about businesses. Could a business convert internal combustion cars to EV cars? And Kathleen and Josh both jumped in with some cool answers. So number one, it is not really proven to be cost effective to turn a internal combustion car into an EV car itself. That's a sort of fascinating idea, but with the cost of electric vehicles coming down so far, that it's just the financials don't work out at this point. However, Josh chimed in too with some great information about rebates and incentives for businesses to convert their fleets to EVs. And so if I can select it here, I'll put that in the chat to everyone. Oops. To everyone. And this is some place where folks can learn about converting their businesses over. Let's see here. Any panelists want to jump in on a question before I just start asking? They had a couple questions, and maybe NRCM or Josh, about transportation, and specifically either mass transit options or other incentives to encourage folks to just simply drive less or to use other transportation options. Josh, you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I love that question. One of my favorites. In addition to electrifying our fleet, we have to also think about moving people around the state in different ways that are less carbon intensive. And that includes public transit, and that includes active transportation, which is like walking and biking. So Maine DOT did come out last year with new plans for public transit throughout the state and for active transportation throughout the state. And we have this year, because of legislation we successfully passed last year, a public transit advisory council that is doing really wonderful work to inform the transportation committee at the state legislature about how we can better plan for and invest in a future where public transit is available in every corner of the state of Maine. We know that rural transit actually can be effective as long as the investment is there. So that is to come, although there's a lot of work to be done. And I would also just shout out, we're working on the trails bond right now. It's a $30 million bond proposal to invest in trails. And that would go a long way towards getting folks onto bikes, onto their feet, and onto other rolling options. But this is something we're working on all the time. We have a car culture here in Maine, and a big part of the conversation is certainly shifting away from single occupancy vehicles in particular towards better alternatives.
Fantastic. Thank you, Josh. We had a couple of questions about the difficulty in navigating the world of incentives and the whole world of, how if you want to do the right thing, how can you best get help? Kathleen put a great resource in the chat, which I just put down here, which is, Kathleen, I don't know if you want to jump in and talk about that at all.
I have to say, I've looked at a lot of the incentive guides from other states, and I think Maine's is the most user-friendly and clear that I've seen. So definitely check that out, whether you're thinking about your home or your car or your business. It really breaks down both what's available in terms of incentives at the state level and tax credits at the federal level. So check out that link.
Thank you. Great question here, I think, for Chess from the City of Bangor Planning Department. Welcome, our friends in Bangor. Does the effort to conserve land consider connectivity between conserved protected land areas and the need for corridors for specific migration northward through the state?
That's a great question, and something that comes up a lot in our meeting space because that is critical. Like I said, we can conserve a whole bunch of low-grade land, but if we're not thinking about habitat connectivity and loss, especially for species that are more threatened by climate change and other factors, we're not doing our job. So yes, that is very much top of mind for us in our work. As I can't talk about the climate crisis without also always talking about the biodiversity crisis, and everything you just raised there is exactly right. So everything intersects with it all, and we're doing what we can to make sure that those priorities for connectivity and beyond are front and center for our group. So it's a great question.
Fantastic. Philip from IF&W raised his hand.
Another member of the Natural Working and Working Lands Group. IF&W.
We are past one, but if Philip is able to unmute and wants to say hello, we always welcome him. You're on mute, sir. I don't know if we can. Yeah, I think Maggie has to figure out how to.
Yeah,
allow
I
you to
asked.
unmute.
Okay, there you go.
There we go. You hear me now?
Yep.
I'll be quick because I know I didn't realize we were over time. Yeah, I just wanted to build on what Chess just replied to that important question about how do we strategically direct our land conservation efforts, because it's a huge question, especially, from IF&W's perspective, especially focused on the biodiversity piece. And we can't do it all. And so with that, I'm sort of going to end with a slightly controversial point, which is that I think that we have a lot more work to do with protecting the places that we already know are incredibly biodiverse now, that aren't protected, that are on private land and are threatened with development, and that's a priority before we start to think about connectivity, which actually is better in Maine than just about anywhere else on the entire East Coast. So migratory connectivity and movement through the matrix is happening pretty well in Maine compared to anywhere else. So we may need to really triage our conservation efforts at what we know is threatened today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to see the state involved in this way, and the passionate folks who are doing this work, and the passionate folks who are coming to listen about it and want to take action. Thank you all for joining today. There are some more questions coming in that we'll work to answer. We'll send an email with additional resources and the recording coming up soon. Want to thank all the panelists for joining. These are the experts who are out there doing the right thing for Maine's future. So thank you, and thank you all for joining. We will see you soon. Have a great week.